My name is Niklas Kosso. I'm an anti-corruption researcher and PhD candidate at the Hertie School of Governance in Berlin, and also currently a visiting fellow here at the Kiev Mohila Academy in Kiev. In the previous lectures of this course, we already heard a little bit about what is corruption, how we define the concept and sort of different views on it, and also what a general research design is and how we can put research together that addresses the issues of corruption and anti-corruption. What I want to talk about in this lecture is the challenge of corruption measurement. So basically, how do you take this idea of what is corruption and the concept of corruption, and how do you measure it? How do you put this into action? And how do you how can you compare corruption in different countries? So the things I want to talk about is first talk you a little bit about why it's difficult to measure corruption, what is the sort of challenge about it. Then I will talk about composite expert indices, which are sort of the most common measurements used for corruption, and also sort of give you a bit of an idea of how you can use them and where you should what you should pay attention to and why you maybe shouldn't use them. I will then speak a little bit about how the concept you take of corruption and the aspects you look of in corruption influence the measurement that you will choose. And we'll then talk about how you can use different surveys that exist in order to derive corruption measurements. Finally, in the last part of this lecture, I will talk about objective scores that are used to measure corruption, which are really what we want in order to track change in anti-corruption policies. So, talking about the challenge of corruption measurement, we really have to note that corruption is something that very rarely happens in plain sight. Corruption is something that happens on the hidden, that people do not really talk about, and sort of in its essence, we speak about that transparency is the opposite of corruption in a way. So because of this nature, corruption is very hard to measure. It's very hard to say objectively if one country is more corrupt than the other, because also by our intuition, we often see corruption everywhere. So the overall definitions are broad, as we already heard. Corruption is often defined as the abuse of entrusted power for private gain. We can see that corruption is an overarching issue that touches upon many different spheres, many different levels of government. And here we really have to sort of differentiate. And we can see that corruption is hard to be measured in one overarching measure. There are some measurements out there which try and do that, and I will talk about them in a minute. But also, I will explain that there are measurements which are used for more specific concepts of corruption, which can also be very useful for your research. We really have to see that specific types of corruption need to be reflected in measurements. So if we want to look at, for example, state capture or grant corruption as opposed to petty corruption, we need a specific measurement for this. The problem in this context is often data availability. While obviously you want to know a lot about corruption and learn how corrupt a country or a sector or a region is, data that proves this is very hard to come by in certain circumstances. In fact, many corruption schemes work because this data is not available. So one thing I really want you to take away from this lecture is that when it comes to the measurement of corruption, you should, on the one hand, look at what different data is out there, but also really think about what does this data reflect? What concept of corruption did people have in mind when they talked about the measurement of corruption and when they gave a number that defines whether a country or region or a sector are corrupt or not.